No king of England was ever so unlucky as John. From the moment when France came into the strong hands of Philip II, the French conquest of Normandy was only a matter of time. Richard I staved off its loss by a fierce concentration on its protection and by reckless expenditure on defence and allies, expedients that brought their own unfortunate consequences for John. These words were written by Doris May Stenton in her 1951 work English Society in the Early Middle Ages, 1066 to 1307. But was John really unlucky, and did he inherit a difficult situation from his brother, or did he bring on his misfortunes himself? Well, the situation that John had inherited on Richard's death in 1199 was certainly far from ideal. Richard had, of course, been a crusader, and crusades came at a heavy price. Almost immediately on becoming king, Richard had set about making preparations to go on crusade, which he had sworn to do along with his father, Henry II, although Henry would not make it. This meant levying taxes, which naturally did not go down too well with the English population, especially with the relentless vigour that Richard and his officials set about raising the required crusading finances. It was said that Richard would sell London if only he could find a buyer. Such was his determination to raise the money he needed. Eventually, Richard set out for the Holy Land, where he would make a name for himself, both among his Christian allies and Muslim enemies. But whilst crusading was considered a noble venture, fighting in the name of Christ, it had real world consequences. With Richard thousands of miles away from his kingdom, England was left vulnerable to potential plots, although the country still had capable men like William Marshall to ensure things didn't get too far out of hand. In fact, the real trouble for Richard's realm came in the shape of the king's brother, John, who had eagerly awaited Richard's departure. John allied himself with the King of France, Philip II, who had cowardly and selfishly abandoned the Third Crusade after the capture of the city of Acre in order to attack Richard's French possessions whilst he was still away. Eventually, Richard ended his own time in the Holy Land and returned westwards, only to be captured by the Duke of Austria, whom he had fallen out with during the Crusade. Richard was eventually handed over to the Holy Roman Emperor Henry VI and spent over a year in captivity. Eventually, Richard was released after a huge ransom had to be paid, with John's and Philip's efforts to keep Richard in captivity failing. Richard's time in captivity had led to another huge financial burden being placed on the English population, as they were forced to pay a ransom for a king they had barely seen. Enmity between Richard and Philip grew, with the King of England accusing his French counterpart of jealousy, and the remaining years of Richard's reign were dominated by his rivalry with Philip. These French wars would only cause more financial pain for England, but Richard's honour was at stake. He could not lose his empire to a man who had done so much to insult him. Meanwhile, John, having plotted against his brother, had fallen into line and was now serving Richard with a seemingly greater sense of loyalty, so much so that even Richard was impressed. However, it would seem fair to say that John clearly sensed an opportunity for him to become king one day. Richard remained without an heir, having just one illegitimate son, and with him preoccupied in France, Richard producing legitimate sons with his queen, Berengaria of Navarre, seemed unlikely, and certainly not at the top of the king's agenda. Although Richard and John had a nephew, Arthur, who technically ranked above John in the line of succession, he was, in the 1190s, only a young child. Should Richard die suddenly, John could potentially become king, and so it proved when Richard did die suddenly, of injuries sustained during a siege in the spring of 1199. On his deathbed, he declared John to be his successor. Whilst John, once known as Lackland, given his status as the youngest and powerless son of Henry II, may now have revelled in his lofty position as King of England, what lay ahead of him gave him far less cause for celebration. The King of France that John had once allied himself with, Philip II, remained determined to reconquer the English held lands in France, and with Richard, that most fierce of warriors, now dead, that became a much easier proposition. Within 5 years, the Angevin Empire crumbled before John's very eyes. But was it the misfortune that Stenton claimed it to be, and that Philip was simply too strong for John, or was it John's own incompetence? I do think John can be considered a touch unfortunate. Desperate to maintain and then regain his father's empire, John had to try and raise money for military campaigns across the Channel, as Richard had done, although John has come under far greater scrutiny. Whilst the loss of their lands in France will be a blow to the barons and England's prestige, the almost constant financial pressures that have been placed upon the country since the very beginnings of Richard's reign was eventually going to prove too much to bear, and John's unscrupulous methods of getting what he wanted was always going to lead to civil war with an already tetchy nobility. The problems of his reign that John has been so often condemned for were not all his own doing. As I've discussed, the battle to hold on to the Angevin Empire was well under way long before John became king, and the war at home over burdensome taxation had already started in the early days of the previous reign. So, in that sense, John was unlucky. But John did not help himself. Any sympathy for his various predicaments throughout his reign are lost by his numerous outbursts of malice. His shocking murder of his nephew Arthur, thus removing a potential rival to the throne and a figurehead for discontented nobles, was truly despicable, and his even more ghastly persecution of William de Broays and his family, starving William's wife and son to death, shows you the type of man that John was, or at least could be: cold, heartless, and cruel. If we return to Doris May Stenton's statement that no King of England was as unlucky as John, I think we can say that John's reign should be looked at with greater context. The problems that dominated John's reign were not new problems and not entirely of John's own doing, so he can't take all of the blame. But his tactless, malicious, and sometimes idiotic personality meant that he was never fit to be a king. And that brings me on to my final point. John should never have been king. It should have been Arthur. For this ultimate oversight, we have to point the finger of blame at Richard. He had seen, to his own cost, the duplicitous nature of John's character, and he still declared him to be his heir. Overall, it's a reasonable assertion to say that the misfortune of John's reign was down to both of these Plantagenet kingly brothers.